Great, thank you, Victor. And thank you, Rina, I don't know if she's here, for inviting me, for helping put this all together. And thank you all for coming to what I think is an amazing endeavor. I regret I couldn't be here for much of the morning. What I'm going to talk about, or what I'm going to make an argument for, is, as the title suggests, banks being public utilities. And the aim here is to sort of reframe the frame of regulatory debates. So I don't want to talk, and we can get into this in the discussion about details about regulation and so on and so forth. But my aim here today is to sort of attack the current framing of the regulatory debates. The current framing is as follows. Banks are like any other profit-seeking firm, and they have to be regulated as such. They are sometimes sort of, pollute. They emit externalities, or they overstep certain regulatory boundaries as far as their contracting is concerned, so on and so forth. We tweak those. If we correct the market failures, if we correct for those infelicities in the way this profit-seeking firm behaves, then we'll get it right. And I think this is a fundamental error, because banks are, as it were, different. They are fundamentally different. They are not like any other profit-seeking firm in a capitalist economy. They are, in fact, take the form of a public utility, and I think we should think of them as such. And then if that succeeds, then I think what we've done is reframed the entire set of sort of regulatory conversations down the road, and all of them get reframed in a completely different light. And in fact, this sort of framing, or my assumption is that this framing of banks as public utilities, as opposed to profit-seeking firms, empowers the more progressive side of each of those regulatory battles in a very fundamental and important way. So that's the argument I'm going to try and make in hopefully not too long-winded fashion. So banks are public utilities. Why? Well, because banks produce money, and money is a public good. That's should be fairly straightforward. Money is obviously partakes the form of a very basic public good. It's not a private good in the same way that a widget is. It is a public good, and that's what banks produce. So what is money, and how do banks make it? Money, to start very basically, is anything that bears a set of specific functions. So money is, of course, a unit of account, store of value, and a medium of exchange. Lots of things have functioned as money over sort of millennia of market exchange, of course, has preceded capitalism, and it is my expectation that after capitalism we will still have markets. Cowrie is, for those who are wondering, is a form of shell that comes from the Maldives Islands, and that functioned as small change in the Indian subcontinent. Cigarettes, of course, the famous POW camp or prisons, the favorite experiment, the favorite sort of metaphor for commodity money that is found in many economics, much of the economics literature. The old standby gold, and IOUs, bills of exchange. In the early modern period, in the 16th, 17th centuries, merchants who had bills of exchange, which are sort of IOUs on their merchandise. So sort of, think of the merchant of Venice here. The ships are coming in, so hold out for a while, and I'll pay you then. Some merchants' bills of exchange were so robust that they would roam very widely before actually being cashed in for specie, and they perform the function of money quite robustly. An expanding economy needs flexible and liquid money. And it turns out that over the years, all of these various forms have been eliminated, and the humble IOU is what now stands for money and what functions as money in modern economies, and by modern I mean pretty much as of the late 17th century. So what is an IOU? An IOU basically, of course, is a form of credit. I promise to pay, it's a piece of paper or some script that basically says I promise to pay the bearer the sum of, say, $100, right? It's an IOU. That functioned as money through much of what is called the free banking period in this country, and I want to sort of argue that this free banking logic persists in modern financial systems in a somewhat muted and implicit form. This is a note from the Erie, the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad Bank, issued, which is obviously a bank attached to some railroad company in Michigan, 1853, and it says the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad Bank will pay $5 to the bearer of this note on demand, right? So that's what the Erie Bank is promising to do. This is an IOU, and of course it takes the form of money, as we can see. this is how money was sort of organized in private banking. It was a promise to pay gold. This, of course, should not be confused with, even when we had a sort of gold standard, the money that stood on top of that was not a form of commodity, it was a promise to pay gold. And that is a very important distinction. It's not a coat check for the gold, representing the gold in, i.e. representing the coat in a closet somewhere. It is a promise to pay gold. And this is what a typical bank balance sheet would look like. They would issue notes in the form of loans. And so where basically, if the bank wanted to make a loan, how would it make a loan? It would issue its own money, right? It would issue its own money. That would be the liability of the bank, which is to say the bank was on the hook for the payment. The loan would be the bank's asset, an IOU due to the loan, due to the bank. And if someone came calling, then you could get a bit of gold, but they wouldn't keep 100% of their asset side in gold. It was a fractional reserve. It wasn't 100% reserve, right? So as you can see, both these sides, it's a balance sheet, so both these sides add up to the same thing. The loans plus the gold add up to 100% of what's on the other side of the balance sheet, right? So it's not, if it were 100% reserve, it would be all gold on one side, and it would be like a coat check, but that's emphatically not what it is. So this is how banking functioned basically in 19th century US. So credits have worked best as money, but the question really is, why is that the case? Why? I mean, credit, after all, is just a social relation. Right? It's just a promise to pay. How is it that this basic social relation has been able to bear the functions of money so robustly? So think about what questions would you ask of a bank? What questions would you ask of this social relation in order for it to be robust enough to bear the functions of money? You have to ask which bank has the strongest set of relations. And by strongest, you could sort of break that down in two dimensions. One, which bank has the sort of biggest network of relations, the biggest depositor base, the biggest set of loans to get sort of comfort in a law of large numbers kind of way. And then you'd ask the question, which bank is always owed money, right? Because the main asset that the bank has is not gold, as we've seen, but is these loans, the ships that are coming into port. That's the main asset that's coming in. That's going to give you cash flow over time, right? And so you ask the question, which bank is always owed money? Which bank always has loans due? I'm going to go bank with that bank. That bank will have the strongest set of social relations and create the strongest IOU that can function best as money. Now think of the following statement. We the people promise to pay taxes, right? That is in some sense implicit in a democratic structure, right? Taxation is exchanged for representation. And so we all, in some sense, all of us always already owe the state taxes. The state has IOUs on all of us, our whole lives, stretching out to our entire lives, right? The state, we're on the hook for our taxes. So in a sense, in any given nation, we are, of course, there can be no larger network than all of us. That's the universal set. But of course, the state is owned by us. The state is just us. We own the state. So we owe the state, but the state is just us. So in a sense, we always owe us money. The state is, in a sense, a kind of bank. The state has the logic, this basic predatory logic is there in the state itself. It's embedded in the structure of taxation representation. And once we sort of suss this out, once we discovered this, we basically invented national money. So that our bank, the central bank, which is backed by our state, issues our money. And this is our national bank. On the liability side, it has note issue, much like the Erie Bank did, but now those aren't Erie Bank dollars, they are US government dollars, they're liabilities of the US state, right? The depositors in this bank aren't humble citizens, but they are banks themselves. Banks have checking accounts with the central bank in order to meet their liquidity needs. And the major asset, of course, is not gold. There might have been some vestige of that, but gold was not as flexible and liquid enough to perform the functions of gold, functions of money as we've seen. So the major asset is our government bonds, and of course, what are government bonds backed by? They're backed by us. They're backed by tax. So all this nonsense of the that you hear about from Ron Paul and the gold bugs and so on and so forth, that the money isn't backed by anything, it's just printing money, it's just running the presses, it's complete nonsense, because of course there is something that's backing our money, and that's basically us. It's the economy that's behind the money, that's undergirding the money the whole time. As if economic life could persist in this kind of virtual reality, and therefore we need the sort of reality of gold behind it. That's a complete fiction. And similarly on the asset side, loans to banks, similarly for banks who lend and borrow to each other to meet their sort of short-term needs, they do so through the central bank. So again, we issue our money to ourselves through our state and it's banked. Our money is backed by us. So what happened to the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad Bank? Well, it's still there, at least in spirit. Because what we did, of course, is not what we didn't nationalize all the way down. We nationalized money, but not banking. We nationalized the apex of the system, but not the entire machinery of the system. And so the front end looks like national money, but the back end is still private banking. Which is to say banks still issue money, still issue that old sort of script. But there's a sleight of hand. It's our money, it's the same money. Banks issue our own money, they issue state money. There are private entities issuing a public good, which is Federal Reserve notes, in the case of the US. Right? And there's a new promise to pay. And it goes like this. The banks promise to keep their exchange rate, as it were, the rate between their money and national money at 1. It's the same thing. It's like a fixed exchange rate system, but the rate of exchange is 1. And so, in short, they are allowed to issue money, but only at the same price as ours. They have a license to print money, to print public money, but at the same price that the Fed sets money, right? And so, First City National Bank, which is the old name for Citibank, so I've just sort of kept it there for purposes of continuity. You can see this logic right here. If you get a loan from the bank, what does the bank do? The bank doesn't print its own notes anymore, it just creates a checking account for you. And you can go and withdraw money from that checking account and do things in the world. Hopefully that will earn you more money than the loan is worth, and you'll pay back and everyone will go home happy, right? If it doesn't, bad loans accumulate, but that's a separate story. Those Citibank checking, that Citibank, those units that Citibank has created have to function as US dollars, 1 for 1, right? So that's what I'm showing here. This Citibank dollars and US dollars have to be equivalent. This is just to remind you of what the Kalamazoo Railroad Bank looks like. It's pretty much the same thing, it's just we have, instead of note issue, we have. So banks get to produce our money by promising that their money is equal to our money. So the big question is, of course, how do we ensure that they make good on their promise? How is it that we can give banks a license to print money, in a sense, a license to produce national Federal Reserve notes and Federal Reserve liabilities, and allow them to sort of do that in a robust way? Well, over time we evolved 3 central control mechanisms in order to make sure that they are on the hook, they are continually able to construct their balance sheet in a way that they can still have their liabilities priced at 1 for 1 with Federal Reserve notes. The first, of course, is regulation. What are they doing with their balance sheet? What kind of loans, what kind of assets are they creating? Are they creating really risky ones, or are they creating really safe ones? Bank inspectors have to go in and figure out what exactly they're doing. A central part of regulation is what came to be called deposit insurance, which is to say, up to a certain level, it's gone up to, I think, $200,000 now, $250,000. The federal government says, we insure all of the bank's liabilities, right? So in a sense, there is only one bank in the US up to $250,000, and that's the Federal Reserve Bank. After that, you're not guaranteed that Citibank liabilities and federal government liabilities are going to be matched dollar for dollar. But up to $250,000, or up to whatever the level of deposit insurance is, you're basically covered. And that's, if like any insurance, if you're insuring someone, then you have to make sure that the insured entity behaves in a sort of incentive-compatible way, and that's part of regulation. The price of money is, of course, the interest rate, and that's monetary policy, controlling the short-term interest rate to make sure that liquidity is not too cheap or not too expensive, not too elastic or not too easy to get, so that the banks don't either overshoot or undershoot in pricing their loans. And just in case if and when everything sort of hits the fan, you need a lender of last resort to make sure that there's going to be enough liquidity in the banks should there be an emergency, and that's the lender of last resort. You have to obviously configure that appropriately, otherwise you generate a certain kind of moral hazard. Configuring these mechanisms badly basically means that you're allowing private profit to trump public interest. That's the public utility element of banking. If you allow private profit in these sort of franchises of the Central Reserve to run ahead of their public mission, then they're going to start extending themselves to a point where they're meeting profit, but they're not necessarily meeting this promise to make their liabilities meet Federal Reserve notes one for one. Overextension, which is a concomitant of behaving in a profit-seeking fashion, compromises this promise, and therefore, of course, leads to a run on the bank. And that's exactly what happened in the financial crisis. You didn't have the sort of mindset, you used to have the mindset in much of the world, especially in the US, that banks were public utilities. That got reframed in this profit-seeking fashion. That then led to excessive risk-taking at the level of the banks. And of course, when that was exposed, there was a run on the banking system. That took place in the shadow banking system initially, that then exploded back onto the regular banking system, and then ultimately onto the Federal Reserve. And then from the Federal Reserve onto the fisc, and from the fisc onto all of us, right? And so ultimately, if we're on the hook, because obviously money is backed by us, if the entities generating money over-generated, then we are going to be on the hook for the bills, which is why you can't allow private profit to trump public interest in this most critical sector. So in short, fixing banking means configuring control, configuring those three key control mechanisms: regulation, monetary policy, and lender of last resort, configuring them so that public interest is put before private interest, and in short, basically means recognizing banks are public utilities and not regular profit-seeking firms. They are very, very different kinds of entities. You can't think of them in regular ways. Banking is a bit of a topsy-turvy world. And when we recognize that, we reset all of these regulatory arguments in a direction that says, okay, we can't foreground profit anymore. It has to be public interest first. Thank you.